Good evening from my headquarters in Kiev. This is Hromadski International Sunday Show, the only prime-time program that looks into the Eastern geopolitical geostorm. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook and YouTube. We are 24/7. My name is Angelina Karyakina, and tonight we're looking into the story that goes way beyond Ukraine and actually Eastern Europe. So let's start from the very beginning. The US President Donald Trump's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, canceled his trip to Ukraine, saying that he doesn't want to step into the circle of the US enemies. He specifically names Ukrainian MP and former investigative journalist Sergii Leshchenko, saying that Leshchenko was meddling into the US 2016 elections. Let's listen to what Giuliani is saying and then come back to the studio.
I'm not going to Ukraine because I think I would be walking into a group of people who are enemies of the president, in some cases enemies of the US. The trip had nothing to do with the 2020 US presidential election, because it is a long way off. Over the next few months, we'll find out about Ukraine collusion with Democrats to affect the election and to help create false narrative against the US president.
So Giuliani claims that Sergii Leshchenko leaked financial documents of the Party of Regions to the Democrats. These documents had allegations against former Trump's head of campaign, Paul Manafort. But let's listen to Sergii Leshchenko, what he really published, which documents he published, and what really this story is about. This is a quite complicated story, so let's take one step at a time, talking to Sergii Leshchenko personally. Sergei, good evening.
Hello. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for coming and talking to us. So why Giuliani exactly is calling you an enemy of the US?
I believe it's misinformation from Ukrainian side, because Mr. Giuliani has a lot of background information, what is going on here in Ukraine, from his specific sources in Ukraine. And the main source here for him is current Prosecutor General Mr. Lutsenko, who decided to stay in power, not to leave the position of Prosecutor General after presidential elections. And Mr. Lutsenko started this long disinformation campaign in US to involve Mr. Giuliani in this game to keep him on the position of Prosecutor General. And he shared a lot of fake or just not real information with Mr. Giuliani. So this fake information, it's about my role, it's about my status in Ukraine, it's about what we have in the court here now. And unfortunately, Mr. Giuliani was misled by Mr. Lutsenko, and then he started to translate this information to the international arena, in the US audience, and so on and so forth. And now we have a situation when I was blamed by Mr. Giuliani as the main enemy of US. It's not true, because I was in US last week and I passed the border with no problems. I have a stamp in my passport to stay in US until the end of October. I spent the whole week in New York with no problems. FBI people knows my contact details. They have all possibilities to stay in touch with me, to ask all questions they want to know. So I'm open for any information to be shared with them if they have any specific questions.
You have some detailed information on what exactly Mr. Lutsenko said.
Yes.
You're saying to Mr. Giuliani, but let's listen to what Lutsenko actually said to his quotation about this whole situation.
In order to curb some people's desire to be political skunks, MP Sergii Leshchenko will be prosecuted and he will be asked questions. Perhaps he will be presented suspicion of disclosing the data of the pre-trial investigation in relation to the so-called black ledger of the Party of Regions, which caused interference in the US elections from the Ukrainian territory. Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, has not violated any Ukrainian laws. At least we do not see any violations at this time. Any company can pay their directors as much as they want.
Okay, Sergei, so you're saying that you know specifically what the General Prosecutor Lutsenko said to Mr. Giuliani. You have some documents. Would you please share them with us?
Yeah, this is the page number 1 from about 7 pages document, which were prepared here in Kiev, and I believe it was prepared by Mr. Lutsenko, and then sent to Mr. Giuliani and to some American conservative media, because I got this from US conservative news outlets. And in this document we have a lot of misinformation, a lot of speculations, and a lot of information which is not based even on some kind of logical explanation. First of all, Mr. Lutsenko says that in March 2014, when just 100 people were killed on Maidan, and when just Ukrainian territory were occupied in Crimea and in some regions on the east, Mr. Biden and Mr. Kerry, that Secretary of State, were involved in bribery in Ukraine to protect business of one former government officials of Yanukovych team. This is the name. The name of this person is Mr. Zlochevsky.
Former Minister of Ecology.
Yes, and I believe it's just impossible to happen because at that time, U.S. attention was how to protect Ukraine from this external aggression, how to build institutions after Yanukovych fled from Ukraine. I cannot imagine that high-rank, very top American officials were involved in this conspiracy at that moment. It's just impossible to believe it. It can happen.
Okay, this is one allegation. We will look into the timeline.
Another allegation is that, like, Mr. Biden was bribed to send money to the son of Mr. Biden, Hunter Biden, and Mr. Kerry was bribed to send money to his stepson, Christopher Heinz, who is one of the main persons in this Heinz family, one of the biggest U.S. food companies. Heinz, you know, ketchup Heinz, they're well known all over the world. I don't really believe that such person can be bribed by some Ukrainian crooks to have loyalty in U.S. But in the theory of Prosecutor General, it happened. And in this 7 pages document, they explain Americans that it happened. And then the last message in this non-paper fictional document, I believe, it was that Mr. Biden visited Ukraine in the January 2017 after Mr. Trump was elected as a president. And Mr. Biden, so I said Mr. Kerry.
You said Mr. Biden.
Yeah, sorry, Mr. Biden, yes. Mr. Biden visited Ukraine in 2017 in January, and then he asked to protect the business of his son in this fake document, and he promised and proposed to build the bridge of communication of Ukrainian top-rank officials with Mr. Trump administration. But it's just impossible to believe that Vice President of Obama administration can build any bridges to Trump administration after the presidential elections when Mr. Trump won this election. But this conspiracy was explained in this non-paper document.
Actually, with all that, why suddenly you are called the enemy?
Yeah, Mr. Lutsenko is trying to sell himself to Americans to protect him on the position of Prosecutor General, because new President Zelensky said he has to go. And he is looking for some argumentation for his conspiracy theory. And one of the argumentation was that I was a person who was involved in this Black Ledger disclosure. And
in 2016?
2016, yes, I was part of this, let's say, disclosure of misconduct of Mr. Manafort, who was convicted in US for almost 8 years in prisons because of violation of law based on Ukrainian background.
Yes, it's important to explain that Mr. Manafort cooperated with the Party of Regions for years, and they had millions of dollars contracts.
Almost
a decade,
and
yes.
Really, I was making my job here in Ukraine as I did it before for many years. I'm a former investigative journalist fighting against corruption. Now I'm a member of anti-corruption committee in parliament. And my main focus, the main focus of my career in journalism, in politics, is anti-corruption fight. And in this anti-corruption fight, I made disclosure of this Black Ledger, and Mr. Manafort was the person who siphoned money from Ukraine, from Ukrainian people, because he was paid by Ukrainian crooks to put Ukrainian corrupt president on the top level. So it was our money, and of course I made my job to disclose this corruption.
Gee, let's look into the timeline.
I had no idea to interfere in American elections, believe me.
Let's look into the timeline. So you indeed disclosed part of the Black Ledgers of the Party of Regions. It was end of the May 2016. Yes. Was Manafort mentioned in those pages that you disclosed?
We had no name of Manafort at that part of Black Ledger. I published 22 pages in May 2016, and Manafort was not mentioned.
Were you the first person to disclose those papers?
No, the reporter of New York Times, Andrew Kramer, made publication. It was August 14, when in New York Times the name of Manafort appeared first time.
So after you disclosed, but Manafort was not mentioned
after that, Anti-Corruption Bureau, it was 18 of August, when Anti-Corruption Bureau, special law enforcement agency, made the official statement on their website that it's true that Mr. Manafort mentioned a number of times in this black ledger, and he took money from Party of Region, and then American judicial system proved that it's true. And I was only, let's say, third in this line, because I made my press conference 19th of August. So 14th of August, New York Times, 18th of August, Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, 19th of August, it was my press conference. But unfortunately, Mr. Lutsenko manipulated this information. He made this misinformation campaign to Mr. Giuliani to mislead him and to make this conspiracy theory about, let's say, anti-Trump campaign here in Ukraine and so on.
Mr. Giuliani also claimed that you are a convicted person here in Ukraine,
Yes,
or you are accused. So let's look into your legal status.
Yes.
What are you actually officially accused of here in Ukraine?
This is another example that Mr. Giuliani was misinformed, because I believe Mr. Giuliani has no idea about myself and about the judicial system in Ukraine. What happened and what information was provided by Lutsenko, Ukrainian Prosecutor General, to Giuliani. He said that I'm a convicted person, but in reality, it was administrative court decision in December last year when one of the Ukrainian crooks, member of parliament, Mr. Rosenblatt, who is under investigation because of corruption, he suited me and head of Anti-Corruption Bureau, Mr. Sitnik, to administrative court. This is the decision of this administrative court. They claimed in this court, which has very low reputation in Ukraine, as Ukrainian journalists, you know this better than me, that I interfered in Ukrainian foreign policy by interfering in American elections. And that's it.
So that's a ruling.
Yeah, this is the decision of the court, but it's not matter of law now because I made appeal, and this decision of court is stopped. So there is no decision for today because we have appeal court, and we have even no judges for today to make this
So
appeal,
it's still
appeal
in court. The appeal is
yes,
still
and there
in
is no real decision of the court for today because it's stopped by appeal court. Second, that administrative court has nothing to do with conviction of person. Administrative court is the court which deals with government and with government institutions. And even in Ukraine, we have special regulation which prohibits to prosecute members of parliament in administrative court, because member of parliament cannot be part of the administrative court regulation. The whole parliament at all can be part of this administrative court regulation. But they made this conspiracy and they made this decision of the court which was necessary for their whole conspiracy theory, but which is not based on either Ukrainian legislation or on real facts.
There was another allegation just this week. General Prosecutor Yuriy Lutsenko said that this is also in the legal context a weird statement, but still this is something that General Prosecutor does quite frequently. He announces the coming allegations. He said that he will charge you, that the General Prosecutor's office will charge you with disclosing details of these black ledgers of the Party of Regions. Were you actually charged with that or not?
I was even not invited for interrogation. I asked Mr. Lutsenko as a Prosecutor General, please make as soon as possible this investigation. Please interrogate me, make interview of me. Please withdraw my immunity as Member of Parliament. Do this as soon as possible because I don't want to keep this situation the hostage of his desire to stay in power, in office of Prosecutor General. First. Second, if you look deeply in the situation, Mr. Lutsenko violated the law as well. And it's not my statement, it is a statement of one of the detectives in Prosecutor General office who works under Mr. Lutsenko.
Disclosing the details?
Mr. Gorbatyuk, who is investigating Mr. Manafort and Black Ledger, he said that Mr. Lutsenko violated the law because he has no approval from detectives to disclose this information.
We actually earlier we spoke to the special prosecutor Sergii Gorbatyuk, whose department actually investigated the black ledgers. Let's listen to what he has to say about this case.
After December 2017, when MPs voted to increase criminal liability for disclosure of pre-trial investigation data, virtually any communication from law enforcement agencies on the investigation of criminal proceedings can be interpreted as disclosure of the data of the pre-trial investigation. Previously, it only concerned the data that defamed a person who had been disclosed as a criminal offender, or disclosure by an investigator, prosecutor or lawyer who were warned about non-disclosure of the data. MPs can be prosecuted as an entity, But if they are not warned directly about the non-disclosure of the data of the pre-trial investigation, they are not held criminally liable.
And what is interesting that Mr. Gorbatyuk also said that there is no reasons to persecute me because I had no legal status in this case at all. So what we see that manipulation of Mr. Lutsenko, our Prosecutor General, went too far. I believe he went too far with these attempts to stay in power, and he put us as Ukrainians, the whole country, as a ball on this football match between Democratic and American Republican Party in US presidential election 2020. And they started to play the football by us as a ball on this game. You know, it's horrible.
Why this football is actually relevant? We have heard from Mr. Giuliani that these implications has something to do with the coming elections, 2020 elections, and it has something to do with Joe Biden's role. You already started explaining what Biden has to do to this whole case, to Mr. Zlochevsky and to the former corrupt authorities of Ukraine. So let's look into Joe Biden's role in Ukraine, and also to his son's role in the company owned by the fled minister. So what is actually his role in Ukraine in 2014 when the allegations came?
Mr. Biden was vice president who was visiting Ukraine very often, and in some case he was the person who supported the strong campaign of Ukrainian civil society and anti-corruption investigative journalists, of opposition members of parliament, to fire one of the corrupt prosecutor general, the predecessor of Mr. Lutsenko. So Biden decided to push this agenda forward. Not only Mr. Shokin, but also he was involved in the campaign to withdraw one of the members of parliament who also crooked, Mr. Martinenko. So
Joe Biden...
it was put as a conditionalities for further cooperation of Ukraine and US, because American government would like to be sure that financial support provided by American taxpayers cannot be stolen by Ukrainian crooks.
Okay,
that is why he
Joe
was
Biden,
involved in this campaign.
Joe Biden put it as a condition for the further financial cooperation between US and Ukraine, sacking then General Prosecutor Shokin.
Yes.
Now the Republicans, and specifically Mr. Giuliani, is saying that Biden had his interests to sack Mr. Shokin because allegedly Shokin was looking into the case of Burisma. It's a gas company owned by then fled former Minister of Ecology Mykola Zlochevsky, and Joe Biden's son was on the board of that company.
Yes.
Does it hold up? I mean, the timeline, does it really hold up?
By the theory of Mr. Lutsenko, the facts which he put in his conspiracy letter to Giuliani, sometimes we see that it has no connection with real situation, what happened here in Ukraine.
But what is real? Let's look into what is real. So Joe Biden's son,
his son
Hunter,
really worked for Burisma.
Really
yes.
worked for Burisma. He was on the board of directors of that company since 2013, and
Yes.
he, according to New York Times, he left that job in just recently in April this year. So was there really an interest from Joe Biden to sack Shokin, and was really Shokin investigating Burisma?
No. Mr. Shokin was the Prosecutor General who blocked number of anti-corruption investigations in Ukraine, including Zlochevsky case, including Martinenko case, including Leshchenko case, including Diamond Prosecutor case. So that is why we as a civil society and I as a member of parliament was very angry on Mr. Shokin, because I voted for Mr. Shokin to be Prosecutor General. I even argued some MPs to support him because we want to replace previous prosecutor who also was involved in corruption. So in Ukraine we have very poor prosecutor generals in sense of their values, and we had these attempts to appoint the fair one. And when predecessor of Mr. Shokin was fired, I was asking, let's support Shokin, maybe he can be another person, and I voted for him. And then he lost my credibility. I believe he was part of the conspiracy with Poroshenko, and I was very angry at him as my fellow citizens because he did not investigate corruption. And we started to campaign for his resignation. And Mr. Biden, when he visited Ukraine, he supported this idea, but not because of his son, but because of the whole mood in Ukrainian civil society. Regarding Mr. Biden, we can see that few months before Mr. Shokin was fired, American Ambassador Jeffrey Piat asked to investigate Burisma case and Zlochevsky case. So he openly declared that US government would like to see this investigation happen. So American government did not stop this investigation. American government encouraged this investigation by the statement of American Ambassador Jeffrey Piat.
We also actually spoke to the former US ambassador to Ukraine, John Herbst, to get his view on Giuliani's accusations against Ukraine and also the Burisma case. Let's listen to what he has to say.
How should we interpret Rudy Giuliani's accusations against Ukraine? What stands behind it?
I think this is all very, very sad. In some ways, there's no logic to it. I know that the charges against our ambassador and our embassy here in Ukraine are not based upon real information or solid analysis. And the same is true about the charges against Vice President Biden and Burisma. For example, regarding the second question, we know that Biden was a strong proponent of reform in Ukraine, and that's why he criticized Shokin, and that's why our embassy criticized Shokin, and I personally criticized Shokin. If you go back and see that, so I gave a talk at the American Chamber of Commerce, or American Business Association, back in 2016. So the notion that Shokin was a reformer and that Biden was criticizing him in order to protect Burisma just makes no sense. And anyone who knows Ukraine understands that. So what's happened is that Ukraine-related issues have gotten tied up with very emotional American domestic politics. And that's what we're seeing here.
How will then this situation impact the Ukrainian-American relations, given that it's a domestic issue of America? How will it impact in general?
Well, my hope is, my prayers are that it will have no impact. Of course, I'm not just someone who hopes and prays, I'm someone who thinks. And so I'm a little bit concerned that this could have an impact, a negative impact on U.S.-Ukraine relations. This cannot be ruled out, and that's why I think that the whole raising of this issue was a mistake and unfortunate. But certainly, I will try to lessen any possible impact because this is bad not just for Ukraine, but for the United States. The United States has compelling interests in Ukraine. One, to help defeat Moscow's aggression in Donbass, and two, to help this country truly move in a reform direction. And of course, there's been some serious progress over the past 5 years, but not as much as there should have been.
Can you tell us a bit more about Russian-American relations in regard of the meeting with Pompeo, with Lavrov, and then with Putin? Can you say that relations are going to get a bit better after this?
The short answer is I don't know. The longer answer is there's a clearly established pattern of U.S.-Russian relations under President Trump. And that pattern goes something like this. President Trump has an unexplained affection for the Kremlin and for Mr. Putin, which he expresses from time to time. His senior advisors see Mr. Putin as a dangerous political actor who flouts international law and commits aggression. Congress shares that view, the view of the political advisors of Mr. Trump regarding Putin. So President Trump says something somewhat positive about the relationship with Moscow, and his advisors in Congress move American policy in the direction of a tougher response to Kremlin aggression. I think this pattern will continue to hold. I believe that the Pompeo trip to Russia was not in any way a problem. I think Secretary Pompeo spoke in sober terms that reflect our interests. He looked and sounded much better than his predecessor, Kerry, going to Moscow. Because Kerry always sounded weak and like he didn't know what he was doing. Now, we're talking about a meeting between Trump and Putin on the margins of the G20. There's a good chance President Trump will say something soft, but I don't think that the policy will be soft. But I can't be certain.
Okay, so we seem to put the story more or less into the timeline, and I hope our viewers understood what really were the roles of the former US officials and of the current US officials. But my question to you currently is, knowing that you not officially are a part of the president-elect, Mr. Zelensky, but you cooperate as an expert, as a consultant, and you stay in touch with the president-elect. How does this whole story affect your relations with Mr. Zelensky and the potential relations between US and Ukraine?
Of course, this story cannot have no impact on these relations. Of course, this story toxicated relations between Ukraine and US because of this role which Prosecutor General played in Ukraine and in US. What will happen further, I don't know, but I believe that the new president has all rights and all opportunities to construct these relations with American government in the way he would like to make it. So I don't want to be any barrier, any problem in these relations. If he believes that to distance myself from the team is important for current moment, I said, please make it. I don't want to be the barrier in the situation which happened now. I said him that you have a free hand to do what you want in this situation because you're responsible for the whole country, for Ukraine. I should not be the problem in these relations, and it's up to you to decide what is my role after this gonna be. So I believe we have situation now when some politicians from previous government, like Mr. Lutsenko, who is a prosecutor general without legal education, who is one of the crooks of previous government, he decided to keep whole situation as a hostage of his future career, who did not resign after his colleagues from Poroshenko team resigned. Look, last days we saw a number of acts when members of Poroshenko team publicly announced we are leaving because our president lost. But Mr. Lutsenko decided to stay, and he continued this dirty campaign, smear campaign against me, and to infiltrate Ukraine as a problem in this US-Ukraine relations, as a stakeholder of Democratic and Republican parties' battle in the US. I believe for this moment, President-elect Mr. Zelensky has to make his job and to normalize these relations with American government.
Are any of the American officials coming to the inauguration, in your knowledge?
I have no idea, but as I remember, it was a big issue of the date, and if inauguration happened 1st of June, probably Mr. Pence would come. But since we have this inauguration date 21st of May, I'm not sure that in very short notice somehow from a very top level can visit Ukraine because of this schedule.
How about you, yourself? Will you be there at the inauguration?
Yeah, I'm a member of parliament. Of course, I'm going to be on inauguration because it's my job to be in parliament, to sit on my chair. And of course, I'm going to be on inauguration, and I'm proud that I was part of these changes in Ukraine. I'm proud that this story happened in Ukraine when we have new president, one president who was involved in corruption, leaving power, and now Mr. Zelensky has very strong support of society to continue this reform agenda, to demonstrate that his desire to change the status quo of oligarch corrupt interest is going to be changed, and we will have fair government in Ukraine.
Have you any idea whether Mr. Zelensky will change the general prosecutor? We have heard from him personally that he wants some changes.
I have some approval from inside that he continues to stay on this position. The prosecutor general has to go, and it's really based on the logic, because Mr. Lutsenko is a part of Poroshenko clan. Mr. Poroshenko lost election. He has to go together with his boss. It's first. Second, credibility of Mr. Lutsenko is very low. He has no support in society. He has no support inside the prosecutor general system. He has no support of media or civil society or international community. He has only support in very inner circle inside the US establishment. And he's trying to play this game to save his power.
Yes, but how about Mr. Zelensky? Does he have his clear candidate who has support from the civil society and respect from...
I believe Mr. Zelensky has no communication of this issue because he still has this problem with Mr. Zelensky. Since
with Mr. Lutsenko.
Sorry, Mr. Zelensky has no contact with civil society about the successor of Mr. Lutsenko because Mr. Lutsenko stays in power. So since he lost, since he left, I believe new president will have this communication about new prosecutor general.
Okay, thank you so much, Sergei.
Thank you for inviting me and
for
for
sharing.
letting me explain what happened.
We hope it was really clear, even the story is complicated. You can look into that story deeper and in more details on our website.
May I say also one message? Maybe some American journalists will also watch our show. I openly asked Fox News to provide me opportunity to speak about this problem because I was blamed in their TV program that I'm enemy of US and enemy of Mr. Trump. I have no response from Fox News for today. I asked Fox News to provide me opportunity to speak because I have this right to answer on the allegations which were claimed in their TV show. Also, I'm asking American journalists, if you cover the story, please ask my comment. If you're a journalist from The Hill, which is involved in this campaign, please make interview with me. I want to explain my side, my story, my explanation what is going on. Because American citizens have to understand what has happened from both sides, not only from one biased position of Prosecutor General.
Well, sure, that is also up to Fox News whether they will communicate that
but
to you.
But it's a general rules of the journalistic standards to provide second opinion.
We'll see that. Thank you again. Thank you once again. Thank you so much. But we also talked to Senior Director for Human Rights and Human Freedoms at the McCain Institute, David Kramer, who also shared his thoughts about how this whole story may implicate relations between Ukraine and the US. Let's listen to what he has to say.
I think what is happening is Ukraine is getting caught in the middle of American domestic politics. And I think Mr. Giuliani is trying to change the narrative from what has been the case for the past 2+ years in the United States, allegations of collusion between the Kremlin and the Trump campaign, and is now trying to argue that there instead was collusion between Ukraine and the Clinton campaign. And on top of that, that there was some corrupt activity in which the former vice president's son was engaged, Hunter Biden, with his position on the board of Burisma. And so it seems to me that there is a strong push in which Ukraine is getting caught in the middle as we in the United States look ahead to our 2020 elections. And he, as you know, was planning to come here this week to try to meet with Mr. Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials to, as he said very explicitly in an interview with the New York Times, to meddle in the investigation. And an investigation that, as far as I understand, ended before Mr. Shokin was replaced as Prosecutor General. And I don't quite understand what investigation he was pointing to. So it's a very complicated issue, but there is, I think, a rather simple underlying theme, which is Mr. Trump's supporters are arguing that there was collusion between the Clinton campaign and the Ukrainians, and that also Hunter Biden was involved in activities here that he shouldn't have been. I think that's what it boils down to, essentially. With the conclusion of the Mueller report, which found that there was no criminal activity between the Trump campaign and the Russians, there was no conspiracy. The term collusion in English is not a legal term criminally. The issue would have been whether there had been a conspiracy between Trump campaign officials and Russian officials, and Mueller and his team found that there was not evidence of that. It did find that there were extensive contacts, but not to the point of crossing the criminal threshold. Despite that, the Mueller report also found that there were instances of obstruction. So what the Mueller report stated was it could not conclude that Trump had committed any criminal activity, but it also could not exonerate the president. It could not find him not completely innocent. And what we see since the conclusion of the Mueller report is a strong effort by committees in the U.S. House of Representatives, which the Democrats control, to launch further investigations into the activities of 2016 between the Trump campaign and the Russians. And so I think the hope of the Trump side that this would go away once the Mueller report was completed, they're realizing that is not happening, that the Democrats in the House are continuing to investigate, continuing to push. There is also the element where Mr. Lutsenko, the Prosecutor General, also seems willing to go along with this, where he apparently was in touch with Mr. Giuliani back in January, if not before, had given some interviews to John Solomon from The Hill, and seemed particularly interested in trying to criticize the U.S. Embassy here. The impact on U.S.-Ukrainian relations is what I'm most worried about. I don't want there to be an impression in the United States, in Washington, or in the Trump administration that Ukraine or Ukrainian figures or the new president and people around him are anti-American or anti-Trump. Zelensky won in a landslide victory on April 21st. I happen to have been here to observe it. And I don't think anyone knows what his positions are. I'm not sure he has fully formed his positions on things. I don't think there's any reason to suspect him of anti-Americanism or an anti-Trump view. He is somebody who is, I'm sure, scrambling to put a team together to figure out how to address the challenges that Ukraine faces. My guess is the last thing he wants to do is to get involved in an American political issue. And frankly, I would suggest that his response in saying he didn't want to meet is the right one. Mr. Giuliani apparently was interested in coming here to meet with Zelensky, the president-elect, to urge him to continue an investigation of American activity in Ukraine and with Americans. The United States for years has advised Ukraine and many other countries in the region, as you transition from the communist system imposed on you by the Soviet Union, that you should not politicize the legal and judicial procedures, that they should be independent, they should be based on evidence, they should be based on rule of law. And what Giuliani was proposing to do was to come here to meet with the president, the new president-elect, to urge him to investigate all of this. That's not the way it should be done. If there's evidence, produce it. If there isn't, move on. But it's best for Mr. Zelensky, I think, to focus on what should be his priorities, which is dealing with corruption in Ukraine, dealing with Russian invasion and threats, focus on addressing the economic situation here, and keep his attention focused on the situation here in this country. It's a little unfair, I think, frankly, for outsiders to come here when Zelensky has to put a team together. The Rada apparently is going to decide today when the inauguration will be. He has to get ready for that. He has to address the needs of Ukrainians who voted for him. There are high expectations for him. He's got the Russians to deal with. Putin challenged him 3 days after his victory. And to have this thrown at him, I think, is not very fair for him. My impression from what I know is that she has been an unfortunate victim caught in the middle of this. I've known her for maybe 15 years, going back to when I served in the State Department in the George W. Bush administration. Everything I know of her is that she is an excellent career diplomat. She's not a political figure. I've never heard her voice opinions of the current president one way or another, pro or con. She represents the United States. She is the president's representative here in Ukraine. She was nominated before the US election in 2016. And she's been here through a difficult time for Ukraine, first and foremost. So I think it is unfortunate and unfair that her name has been dragged into this. As I say, I think she's done a great job throughout her career in a number of difficult and challenging circumstances. And I know she cares passionately about this country, as well as U.S.-Ukrainian relations. I think she's represented the United States very well, and I know she's leaving a little earlier than was anticipated. Her plan was to leave this summer, but I think she should go out feeling very proud of what she has done here.
And we'd really like to remind you that Hromadske is an independent media. You can support us, not only by reading, following us, but also by donating. You can go to our website and donate. Press donate on the right top corner of the site. You can also subscribe to our newsletter and follow us 24/7. Thank you for being with us. Follow Hromadske.